A promise, I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome to today's video where we are looking at what we call the stomach layers. If it is your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe. You put on the notification bell so that whenever I upload a video, you are the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the stomach layers. We are going to be following these kind of the objectives. We shall look at the brief overview of what we call the stomach. We look at the layers of the stomach, and finally we shall look at what we call the enteric nervous system location within the different layers of the stomach. Let's dive in and see the brief overview of what we call the stomach. Now, the stomach is going to be that muscular tube structure that is going to be residing in what we call the epigastric region, with some part of it going into what we call the left hypochondriac region. Okay, so now it is going to be in between what we call the esophagus, that is superiorly, and then even also going to be having what we call the duodenum, meaning that the stomach is going to be the structure that is going to be connecting the esophagus to what we call the duodenum. Okay, so now the stomach has very many parts. So now let's go ahead and see the parts that make up the stomach. Now, this part here, just as you move from what we call the esophagus, as you slightly enter into what we call the stomach, the whole of this area here is what we call the cardia, okay? And it's within this cardia that you're going to be having what we call the cardiac sphincter, or what we call the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, and then when you have this kind of the dome-shaped structure up here, this dome-shaped structure here is what we call the fundus, and this fundus is going to be helping in storing some of the indigested food and even also some what we call some of the gases. Okay, then the whole of this structure here down here, the biggest one, the biggest part that make up the stomach, you know how it is called? It's what we call the body of the stomach. It can also be called the corpus. Okay. And then when we come just down here, this is where we're going to be looking at what we call the pyloric antrum. Okay, here we have what we call the pyloric antrum, and then finally we have what we call the pyloric canal. Okay, and of course the pyloric canal is going to be terminating on this kind of the sphincter, which we call the pyloric sphincter. Okay, so now this is the brief overview of what we call the stomach. And of course you're going to be having the greater curvature, and then also going to be having what we call the lesser curvature. So now that's the brief overview of what we call the stomach. So now let's go ahead and look at what we call the layers of the stomach. Now, the layers of the stomach are going to be almost the same as the layers of the entire GIT, but we're going to be having a very slight difference somewhere within these layers of the stomach. Okay, so now generally the whole GIT and the stomach at large has 4 basic layers. Okay, so now we have four basic layers, okay, of generally the stomach and then the GIT at large. Okay, so now we are going now to first cut a very small portion of the stomach. We zoom it inside and see how these layers are going to be arranged. Okay, so now you're going to be now allocating these layers from inside going outwards. Okay, so now the first layer inside is what we call the mucosa. Okay, the first layer inside is what we call the mucosa. Now the mucosa is going to be the innermost layer, and this layer has 3 sub-layers within it. What are the 3 sub-layers of what we call the mucosa? Now we have what we call the epithelium. Okay, we have what we call epithelium. Okay, and of course the epithelium is going to be now that kind of the innermost layer that is always in contact with what we call the food matter in the stomach. Okay, and then next to the epithelium we have what we call another layer which we call the lamina, propria. Okay, lamina propria. Okay, and then another layer within the mucosa is what we call muscularis. Mucosae. Okay, muscularis mucosae. And of course this is going to be a very thin layer of what we call the ethmosis muscle that's going to be aiding in what we call slight kind of what we call contraction, leading into what we call the release of different substances from what we call the gastric glands. Okay, it is super very important. So now that's the innermost layer of what we call the stomach. So now as you come out next to what we call the mucosa, we have the second layer. You know how the second layer is called? The second layer is what we call the submucosa. okay, is what we call the submucosa. And of course, this submucosa is going to be having a lot of the blood vessels, what we call the lymph vessels. And then the very unique feature with this kind of the submucosa layer is going to be having one of the branches of what we call the enteric nervous system. You know, the enteric nervous system has two divisions. It has what we call the enteric, and then even also what we call the submucosal plexuses. So now we are going to be finding the submucosal plexuses within the submucosal layer. Okay, so now something unique is that we're going to be having what we call submucosal plexus. Okay, submucosal plexus is going to be found in this area. The submucosal plexus can also be called the Meissner's plexus. Super very important. Whenever it is activated, it's going to be leading into what we call glandular secretions. Okay, it's going to be leading into what we call glandular secretions. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now as you move out, after what we call the submucosa, we got now another third layer. You know how the third layer is called? The third layer is what we call muscularis. Muscularis externa. Okay, muscularis externa. Now, this one I'm going to be paying much attention to this one because it is one which is a bit slightly different from the entire layers of the GIT. Okay, now within the muscularis externa, we again have three sub layers. Now, what are these three layers that make up the muscularis externa? The first one outside, we have what we call the outer longitudinal layer, and then we also have what we call the middle circular, okay, the middle circular layer, and then we also have what we call the inner, okay, the inner oblique. Okay, the inner oblique layer of what we call the muscularis externa. So now, let me now drive this muscularis externa. We bring it here in this model of the what we call the diagram of what we call the stomach. We see exactly what are we meaning when we talk of muscularis externa. So now, the whole, we have these three layers. We have this one, and then this one. All of them together, they are making what we call muscularis externa. So now let's see. And when we talk of the outer longitudinal, on these layers, where is the longitudinal or the outer longitudinal? Now, this layer here, this one here, is what we call the outer, longitudinal. Okay, outer longitudinal layer of what we call the muscularis externa. And then this one here is what we call the middle, okay, is what we call the middle circular, layer, okay. And then the innermost one, this one here is what we call the inner, oblique, okay, is what we call the inner oblique. Now, this is an exception in the muscularis externa of the rest of what we call the GIT. Now, in the other layers of the GIT, what we call the muscularis externa, like for the case of the esophagus and the intestines, we do not have what we call the inner oblique. Okay, the rest of the layers of the GIT, we have the muscularis externa having only the longitudinal and even also what we call the circular layer. This is an exceptional. Okay, this is an exceptional that in the stomach, in what we call muscularis externa, we have a third layer of the muscles which we call the inner oblique. Super very important, and is also such another beautiful thing. You will not see the inner oblique in the esophagus. You will not see the inner oblique in what we call the intestine muscularis externa. Okay, so it is now such another beautiful thing. Okay, and then we have what we call the fourth layer. Okay, the fourth layer is going to be the outermost layer. Now, before we go to the fourth layer, it is within the muscularis externa that you're going to be having now our second division of what we call the enteric nervous system. You know how we call it? This one is what we call the enteric. Okay, enteric. Okay, and then some other people call it the Uwe badges. Okay, what we call the Uwe patches. So now we are going to be having this kind of the my enteric plexus residing between what we call the longitudinal and even also what we call the circular muscles, and it is this kind of the enteric nerve plexus that's going to be causing what we call peristaltic movement. Okay, so now the function of the my enteric plexus is going to be aiding in what we call peristalsis, okay, or even what we call the GIT motility. It is such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now we have seen that the submucosal plexus is going to be in what we call submucosa, and then the enteric plexus is going to be residing in what we call muscularis externa. Okay, and then when we talk about the last layer of the stomach outside, this one is what we call the serosa. Okay, is what we call the serosa, but you may find some other people calling it the adventitia. Okay, the adventitia. It is the outermost layer of the what we call of the stomach, having some little bit of what we call the blood vessels, and it's going to be the one going to be in contact with what we call the peritoneum. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. So now there are mainly four basic layers of the stomach: the mucosa inside, having these other sub layers, the submucosa next, and then the third one as muscularis externa, and then the last one outside. This one is going to be the outermost. Okay, it's going to be the outermost layer of stomach. Okay, the outermost layer of the stomach. Okay, so now and again, of course, when you come inside the stomach, we're going to be having this kind of the folds. Okay, how do we call these folds which are going to be inside the stomach? You know how they are called? These ones are what we call the rug. Okay, these ones here, they are what we call the rug. Okay, they are what we call the roof of the mucosa. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now in the next video we are going now to be looking at what we call we shall go again deep in detail of what we call the mucosa, and we extract all these lamina, what we call the epithelium, the lamina propria, and even muscularis externa, muscularis mucosae, and we dive inside it and see exactly where do we find what we call the gastric glands, and even all those kind of the layer of the cells that are going to be lining what we call the gastric mucosa, and even also those other cells which are going to be lining what we call the gastric glands. Okay. So now, TUMNAD, we have just talked a lot of things in what we call the stomachal layer. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please, you can support me, and you can do that by a couple of minutes. You just like the video, comment down in the comment section, you share this video to someone else that whom you think that this kind of information is so much helpful. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. It has been TUMNAD all along, as always, until we meet next time.